Hey guys, it's Mr. Schmidt here, and in this video we're going to start Unit 13, Fiscal Policy, by looking at the business cycle. And so really what we want to do with the remainder of the time in the course, or at least the vast majority of it, is to look at how do we stabilize the economy, right? Because remember, macroeconomics is basically three things. How is the economy doing? How do we stabilize it in the short run? And then grow it long term. And so we spent a lot of the last quarter looking at how was the economy doing, GDP, unemployment, inflation. We looked at how to model the current state of the economy using aggregate supply and demand. And so we're going to spend the next 3 units looking at how do we manipulate the model when it isn't doing what we want it to do, when we're not in long run equilibrium. How do we get it back there without waiting on the economy to quote unquote fix itself, which we know can take years, and that may not make a lot of good sense if people are hurting in the here and now. And so we're going to start by looking at something called the business cycle to do that. The business cycle is a model of the short-run fluctuations of the macroeconomy. And that term short run is very important here. This isn't really about the long run. It's about how does the economy deviate from the long run equilibrium of an economy. So it's another way of really looking at aggregate supply and demand. Because if we're not at long run equilibrium, we are fluctuating away from that equilibrium, which isn't good. I think a better way to understand the business cycle is to look at it. So this graph here is a model of the business cycle. You can see on the x-axis we have time, on the y-axis we have real GDP. Now before I go any further, let me just say that you will never ever have to draw this on the AP macro exam. You probably will just need to be able to recognize it, but its importance goes beyond the AP exam, and it goes beyond just looking at it, because what macro really is trying to do is to stabilize this cycle. So you see kind of the dark red squiggly line here. Those are the short run fluctuations in the economy. The black line that is going up is full employment, long run equilibrium. And so we want that black line to increase, because when it's doing that, real GDP, long run real GDP, full employment output is increasing. So that's economic growth. So we want that line to be increasing over time. What we're trying to do is to keep that red squiggly line that you see here as close to the black line as possible. We're trying to smooth out those fluctuations to keep the economy as close to the black line, as close to long-run equilibrium, full employment, as humanly possible, okay? But of course, deviations do exist. We can want there to be no deviations, but oftentimes there are. And so if we're above the black line, this is called a positive output gap. You often also see it called an inflationary gap. We'll talk more about output gaps in the next video, so don't freak out too much about this right now. But a positive output gap is where you have rising real GDP, which is good. You do have lower unemployment. Remember that inverse relationship between those two things. More people are needed to make the stuff. And you also have higher inflation. And that's the problem with positive output gaps, because at first they look like great things. Don't you want more GDP? Don't you want lower unemployment? Yes, but not at the cost of inflation. And so positive output gaps are not good because, for one, they're not sustainable, and two, they cause inflation. And so when we're at peak positive output gap, yes, that is called a peak, when basically the economy is as far above the full employment line as it can possibly be. So we're the furthest away from the full employment line above it. The other side of the coin is when we're in what's called a recession. Sometimes you hear that on TV or on the news. And so a recession is when the economy is dipping below the black line. And so we have high unemployment, lower real GDP, as you can see on the graph, and lower inflation. And so the problem with negative output gaps or recessionary gaps is that high level of unemployment. People don't have jobs, stuff isn't being produced. And so when the economy bottoms out and it gets as bad as it can get with unemployment, that's called a trough or a bottoming of the economy. And so neither positive or negative output gaps are a good thing for the economy. And so what we're trying to do is basically keep that black line increasing over time. We're trying to keep long run real GDP increasing. That's what we're trying to do, is to move this real GDP so that we can have sustained higher levels of output without having to deal with inflation and unemployment. Because what you're going to see moving forward with stabilization policy, and we'll talk again more about that in future videos, is policymakers are faced with a really hard choice. Either do you worry about inflation or do you worry about unemployment? Because with positive output gaps, you're dealing with inflation. With negative output gaps, you're dealing with unemployment. And fixing one gap moves you towards the other, right? And so it's a tricky balance to get yourself as close to the black line as possible without going to the other side of the line and dealing with the other problem. And so what we're going to be doing in these next few units is really trying to understand, how do we, first of all, model these difficult situations? How do we model positive output gaps? How do we model negative output gaps? And then how can we, as policymakers in the government, fix these gaps and restore the economy to the black increasing line that represents full employment? So basically, the goal of macroeconomics in the short run is to flatten out this red wavy line and get it as close to the black line as possible. The long run goal of policymakers is to keep extending the line, is to get more economic growth over time so that we are more prosperous as a country, as an economy. So we want to eliminate recessions, we want to eliminate positive output gaps that are causing inflation, and basically get the economy to long run equilibrium as best we can. And so that's what we're going to look at over the next few videos. But that's end units. But that's all for this video on the business cycle. Until next time, have a good day.